I had just gotten home from work, tired but content. My little house stood at the end of the cul-de-sac, the warm glow of porch lights welcoming me back. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I parked my car in the driveway, stepping out with the kind of relief that only comes after a long day. But as I turned to look at my house, something was wrong. My brain refused to process it at first. The porch was gone. The windows were gone. The walls were gone. My house was gone. Where my home had stood just hours ago was now a pile of rubble, a flattened wasteland of shattered wood and broken memories. My stomach twisted into knots, my breath hitched, and I felt my knees go weak. I wasn't standing in my driveway anymore. I was standing in the ruins of my life. Neighbors stood at a distance, some watching in horror, others whispering amongst themselves. A man in a construction vest stood near the wreckage, clipboard in hand, looking entirely unbothered. My voice finally returned, raw and trembling with rage. What the hell happened to my house? The man barely glanced up. Demolition ordered by the HOA. He turned a page on his clipboard like he was reading off a lunch order. Your property was in violation of the neighborhood's aesthetic standards. The board approved the teardown this morning. For a moment, the world went silent. A ringing sound filled my ears, a slow burning rage that boiled beneath my skin. I had followed every ridiculous HOA rule. I had paid every single fee on time. I had spent years making my home exactly the way they wanted, and they demolished it just like that. I took a slow, shaky breath, forcing words out through clenched teeth. Where is the approval notice? The man smirked like I had just asked for the meaning of life. We don't deal with that. The HOA sends those. You can take it up with them. My fists clenched so tight that my nails dug into my palms. Take it up with them? My home was a pile of rubble, and this guy wanted me to take it up with the same corrupt clowns who had just destroyed it? The HOA had always been a nightmare, but I had no idea they would take it this far. It had started small, letters nitpicking the color of my front door, threats over a trash bin left out a few minutes too long, endless fines for violations that were clearly just power trips. I had complied at first, thinking it was just part of living in a controlled neighborhood. But no matter how much I followed the rules, they always found something new to complain about. The president of the HOA, Margaret Landry, was a woman who thrived on control. She wasn't just a rule enforcer. She was a tyrant, the kind of person who believed a position of authority, no matter how small, gave her the right to play dictator. And now, she had taken everything from me. I turned back to the construction crew. Who signed off on this? The man shrugged, handing me a copy of the demolition permit. My eyes darted over the paper, heart hammering against my ribs. It had my address, my name, and at the bottom, Margaret's smug little signature. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't some misunderstanding. This was deliberate. I spun on my heel and stormed toward her house, my steps quick and fueled by sheer fury. My house wasn't just knocked down. It had been erased. There was no warning, no chance to save anything. My furniture, my clothes, my personal belongings all reduced to splinters and dust because of some fabricated violation. I pounded on Margaret's door, and when she finally opened it, she had the nerve to look surprised. "Oh, it's you," she said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "I was just about to call you." My pulse roared in my ears. "You destroyed my house." She sighed, like I was the one being unreasonable. "Your property was a blight on the neighborhood. The board voted to have it removed. You voted to demolish someone's home." My voice rose, barely containing the storm raging inside me. Margaret crossed her arms. "It was for the good of the community. Your property wasn't in compliance, and it was bringing down the value of the neighborhood." I stared at her, the sheer audacity of her words making my vision blur with rage. This wasn't about violations. This was personal. Margaret had always targeted me, looking for any excuse to find me, harass me, and now wipe out my home. She waved a manicured hand. "If you have complaints, you're welcome to file an appeal with the board." I laughed. The sound was cold, humorless. "The same board that just voted to erase my home? You expect me to sit in a meeting and politely request you to undo the damage?" Margaret's lips curled into a smug smirk. "I suggest you lower your voice, dear. Causing a scene won't help you." It took everything in me not to lunge at her. I wanted to scream, to tear down her perfect little house the way she had torn down mine. But rage alone wouldn't fix this. It wouldn't bring back what I had lost. I took a deep breath, my hands trembling at my sides. "You think this is over?" Margaret's smirk faltered just slightly. I leaned in, lowering my voice to a deadly whisper. "You just made the worst mistake of your life. Without waiting for a response, I turned and walked away. Every step I took over the rubble of my home, every splinter of wood and shattered memory beneath my feet, fueled the fire inside me. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Margaret and her HOA had destroyed my home. Now, I was going to destroy them. I spent the entire night sitting in my car, staring at the ruins of what had once been my home. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it. Margaret's smug face. The casual way she dismissed the destruction of everything I had worked for. My entire life had been reduced to debris because of her and the corrupt HOA she controlled like a personal kingdom. The anger inside me wasn't just simmering anymore. It was boiling over. By morning, I knew I needed to act, but the first roadblock hit me before I even started. The police barely looked interested when I called. They arrived on the scene, took a few photos, and treated the entire thing like a minor property dispute. The lead officer, a guy who looked like he had already checked out for the day, shrugged as I explained what had happened. HOA got the paperwork, he said, flipping through his notepad. Demolition permits, all in order. It's legal. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Legal? They tore my house down over some fake violations. I didn't even get a warning. He sighed like I was wasting his time. If you have a complaint, you can take it up with the HOA board or file a civil suit. That was it. No arrests, no consequences, nothing. They weren't even going to investigate. Margaret and her cronies had done this before, I realized. They knew exactly how to game the system, how to make sure no one could fight back. The police left, and I was back to square one. The insurance company wasn't any better. They informed me that because the house had been demolished under a lawful order, they weren't responsible for covering anything. My policy didn't include wrongful HOA demolition because, why would it? Who prepares for something like this? I stood in front of the rubble, phone in hand, reading and rereading emails that all boiled down to the same thing. There was nothing I could do. That's what they wanted me to believe. That's what they had made everyone in this neighborhood believe. But I wasn't just anyone. I wasn't going to accept this. If they wanted a fight, I'd give them one. I started with my neighbors. At first, they were hesitant to talk. People had seen what happened to me, and they didn't want to be next. But fear only holds power for so long. The more I talked, the more I found cracks in the HOA's armor. Homeowners started telling me stories. There was the single mother whose fines kept piling up until she had to sell her home. The retired couple who had to repaint their house 3 times because Margaret kept claiming the color wasn't approved. A guy down the street who was forced to replace his perfectly good fence because it was 1 inch taller than the rules allowed. It was a pattern. The HOA wasn't just enforcing rules. They were extorting people, systematically pushing out homeowners they didn't like, and finding ways to drain money from those who resisted. My case was just the most extreme example. One night, I got a call from a man who introduced himself as Ryan. He had lived in the neighborhood for years and had once been on the HOA board before Margaret forced him out. He didn't just have stories. He had proof. We met at a diner outside the neighborhood, away from prying eyes. He slid a flash drive across the table. "Everything's on there," he said, voice low. "Emails, bank statements, the whole scam." I plugged it into my laptop the moment I got home. What I found made my blood run cold. The HOA wasn't just abusing power. They were running a full-scale fraud operation. Margaret and the board were collecting money for repairs that were never done. Fines were being funneled into personal accounts. They had even sold off foreclosed properties at dirt-cheap prices to friends and family. And the worst part? They had done it all legally, or at least they thought they had. They had covered their tracks well, but not perfectly. There were inconsistencies, emails contradicting each other, missing receipts for major transactions, enough to make someone look twice. I spent hours combing through the files, piecing together a picture of just how deep the corruption went. But having evidence wasn't enough. I needed to make sure that when I struck, it was a blow they couldn't recover from. I started small. I leaked some of the less damning details to local community groups, planting seeds of doubt. People who had blindly followed the HOA started asking questions. Then I went bigger. I sent anonymous tips to local news stations, hinting at a major HOA scandal. At the same time, I reached out to a lawyer, a real bulldog of a guy who hated HOAs more than I did. The plan was set, but I needed one last push. Margaret had been careful, but she had one fatal flaw. She was arrogant. She believed she was untouchable, and that arrogance was exactly what I would use against her. I set the trap by playing the desperate victim. I sent an email to the HOA, pretending to be defeated, pretending to beg for a settlement. I acted like I was willing to drop everything if they just paid me something to keep quiet. Margaret took the bait immediately. She didn't just reply. She sent a detailed email explaining how settlements had been handled in the past. She mentioned previous homeowners who had been paid off, and even casually referenced adjusting HOA financial reports to make sure nothing looked suspicious. It was all I needed. The moment I got that email, I forwarded it to my lawyer, the news stations, and most importantly, the state attorney general's office. The fallout was immediate. The local news ran a full expose on the corruption, featuring interviews with homeowners who had been extorted. Reporters dug into the HOA's finances, uncovering even more fraud than I had found. The story spread like wildfire, turning Margaret and the board into public villains overnight. But that was just the beginning. The real bomb dropped when the state launched an official investigation. Within days, auditors were crawling through the HOA's records, questioning board members, freezing accounts. Margaret and her cronies tried to play innocent, but the evidence was too overwhelming. Then came the moment I had been waiting for: arrest warrants. One by one, board members were taken into custody. Margaret was the last to go, dragged out of her house in handcuffs while cameras rolled. I watched from a distance as the woman who had smirked in my face just days ago was shoved into the back of a police car. For the first time in weeks, I felt something other than rage. I felt justice. But I wasn't done yet. I watched from a distance as Margaret was led out of her house in handcuffs. Cameras flashed, reporters swarmed, and neighbors stood on their porches, whispering in shock. Just a week ago, she had been untouchable, ruling over the HOA with an iron grip. Now, she was just another fraudster getting hauled off by the police. But this wasn't enough. I knew how people like her operated. She would deny everything, shift blame, play the victim. She wasn't going down without a fight, which meant I had to make sure the entire board fell with her. The moment Margaret was arrested, the rest of the HOA board members panicked. I could see it in the way they avoided eye contact with neighbors, the rushed conversations they had on their porches, the way they suddenly stopped answering emails. They knew the investigation was spreading. The house of cards was collapsing, and they were scrambling to save themselves. That's when I made my next move. I contacted Ryan again, the former board member who had given me the first batch of evidence. He had a deep understanding of how the HOA operated, and he knew which members were the weakest links. If we were going to take the whole board down, we needed to hit them where they were most vulnerable. He had a theory. Margaret was the face of the corruption, but she wasn't the only one pulling strings. There were two other key players: Paul, the treasurer, and Linda, the secretary. They had been managing the HOA's finances for years, quietly shifting money and covering tracks. I started by feeding information to the authorities. I forwarded more emails, more records of suspicious transactions. But I also knew that wasn't enough. These people weren't just going to sit back and let themselves get arrested. They were going to fight. So, I needed to push them into a corner, force them to make mistakes. Paul was the first to crack. I had gotten access to a few of his financial records, and what I found was even worse than I expected. He had been using HOA funds to pay off his personal debt. Thousands of dollars had been transferred from neighborhood dues directly into his personal accounts, disguised as maintenance fees. I leaked this to the local news, and within hours, reporters were knocking on his door. Paul panicked. He went on record denying everything, but the damage was done. His face was plastered all over the news, and homeowners started demanding answers. Within a day, his lawyer contacted the authorities, offering to cooperate in exchange for a reduced sentence. He gave them even more dirt on Margaret, proving that she had been forging documents and manipulating votes to push her agenda. Linda was next. She was smarter than Paul, more careful, but she had one major flaw. She thought she was above the law. She had kept detailed records of everything, probably thinking she would need leverage one day. I found those records: more emails, more transactions, even personal messages between board members discussing how they could get rid of homeowners they didn't like. I sent this information directly to the state attorney's office. Unlike the local police, they took immediate action. They raided Linda's home, seizing her computer and financial documents. Within hours, she was arrested too. She tried to act like she was innocent, but the evidence was overwhelming. Like Paul, she eventually caved and started talking. With 3 board members already in custody, the rest of the HOA completely fell apart. The remaining members resigned in disgrace, some trying to flee the state to avoid prosecution. But it was too late. The investigation had expanded, and now even the IRS was involved. Years of financial crimes were coming to light, and every single person connected to it was being dragged down. But I wasn't done yet. I wanted to make sure this kind of corruption never happened again. I started working with other homeowners to dismantle the HOA entirely. We held emergency meetings, voted to disband the organization, and took legal action to prevent another corrupt board from forming. The neighborhood had suffered under their rule for too long, and we weren't going to let it happen again. As the dust settled, I finally took a moment to breathe. The people who had destroyed my home were facing real consequences. The neighborhood was free, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I had won. But there was still one last thing I needed to do. I wasn't just going to move on and rebuild quietly. I wanted to make sure everyone knew what had happened. I reached out to national news outlets, sharing the full story of how the HOA had terrorized homeowners for years. The story blew up, spreading across social media and gaining national attention. People from all over the country started reaching out, sharing their own horror stories about HOAs. It became bigger than just my neighborhood. It became a movement. People were demanding change, pushing for stricter laws to regulate HOAs and prevent abuses of power. And then, the final nail in the coffin. The judge overseeing Margaret's case denied her bail. She would remain in custody until trial, facing multiple felony charges. Paul and Linda had already flipped, providing even more evidence against her. She was looking at years, maybe decades, in prison. I drove past her house one last time. The once pristine lawn was now overgrown, the once intimidating presence of the HOA completely gone. The neighborhood was quiet, peaceful. For the first time in years, it actually felt like home. As I looked at the empty lot where my house had once stood, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. They had bulldozed my home, thinking they had destroyed me. But all they had done was give me a reason to fight back. And I had won. The morning after the last of the HOA board members were arrested, the neighborhood felt different. It was quieter, lighter, like a weight had been lifted from the entire community. People who had once avoided speaking to each other out of fear of retaliation now stood in their yards, openly talking, shaking hands, even laughing. For years, the HOA had ruled with an iron grip, making everyone feel like prisoners in their own homes. Now, the dictatorship had fallen. I watched as neighbors who had once been too afraid to stand up to the board finally stepped forward. Some had been harassed for years over minor infractions. Others had been victims of outright financial scams, forced to pay excessive fines or risk losing their homes. They weren't afraid anymore. They were angry, and for the first time, they had the power to do something about it. A town hall meeting was called, this time without the corrupt board controlling it. People showed up in droves, many of them holding stacks of paperwork detailing their experiences. The plan was simple: dissolve the HOA completely. No more ridiculous fines, no more abuse of power, no more intimidation tactics. We would run the neighborhood the way it should have been run from the beginning, by the homeowners, not by a group of self-serving tyrants. The vote was nearly unanimous. A few holdouts wanted to keep an HOA in place, but they were quickly outnumbered. The organization that had caused so much suffering was officially dismantled. The community was free. With the HOA gone, the next step was dealing with the financial mess they had left behind. Bank accounts had been frozen, properties seized, and an ongoing investigation was uncovering even more stolen money. Homeowners who had been unfairly fined over the years were now part of a class action lawsuit demanding reimbursement for everything they had been forced to pay. The courts ruled in our favor. The HOA's assets, including the personal assets of its corrupt board members, were liquidated to pay back the victims. I received a settlement large enough to rebuild my house from the ground up. It wasn't just about getting a new home. It was about proving that I wouldn't be broken by what had happened. The day construction began, I stood on my lot, watching as the first beams were put into place. It was symbolic. They had tried to erase me, to make me disappear, but here I was, stronger than ever. But there was still unfinished business. Margaret had been the face of the corruption, but she wasn't the only one responsible. The legal proceedings against her and the rest of the board dragged on for months. As expected, Margaret tried everything to save herself. She claimed she had no knowledge of the fraudulent activity, that she was just following the advice of the treasurer and secretary. She played the victim, blaming everyone but herself. It didn't work. The evidence was overwhelming. Paul and Linda, desperate to reduce their own sentences, testified against her. Documents proved she had forged signatures, manipulated records, and orchestrated the demolition of my home. The judge wasn't lenient. Margaret was convicted of multiple charges, including fraud, embezzlement, and destruction of property. She was sentenced to 15 years in prison. When the verdict was read, I felt a strange sense of relief. Not joy, not triumph, just relief. Justice had been served. She had spent years terrorizing people, ruining lives without a second thought. Now, she was the one losing everything. Paul and Linda weren't off the hook either. They both received reduced sentences in exchange for their cooperation, but they would still serve time. The rest of the former board members faced heavy fines and legal consequences. Some lost their homes. Others left the state, trying to escape the shame of being publicly exposed. The community would never forget what they had done. With the HOA gone and justice served, life slowly returned to normal. The neighborhood flourished without the constant oppression of petty rules and fines. People repainted their houses the colors they actually wanted. Gardens grew wild and beautiful without the threat of citations. Kids played in the streets again. It felt like a real community, not just a collection of houses under strict surveillance. As for me, I took my time rebuilding. My new home was bigger, stronger, better. Every brick, every beam, every nail was a statement. I wasn't just recovering, I was thriving. I had won, not just for myself, but for everyone who had been silenced by the HOA's corruption. Months after the trial, I got a letter from Margaret. It was handwritten, sent from prison. She rambled about how she had been unfairly targeted, how she had been made into a scapegoat. There was no apology, no admission of guilt, just bitterness and denial. I didn't even finish reading it. I threw it straight into the trash. I moved on with my life, but the story didn't end there. The news coverage of the scandal had drawn national attention. More people started coming forward with their own horror stories about corrupt HOAs across the country. My case had become a symbol of what could happen when people stood up and fought back. It sparked legal discussions, policy changes, and new regulations to prevent HOAs from abusing their power. One day, I drove through the neighborhood, taking in the sight of what it had become. It was no longer a place of fear and control. It was a place of freedom, a place where people actually wanted to live. I had fought for this, and I had won. As I pulled into my driveway, I smiled. They had bulldozed my house, so I bulldozed their entire empire. And I'd do it all over again if I had to. I never thought I would become a symbol of justice. But that's exactly what happened. My battle against the HOA wasn't just about getting revenge. It was about exposing corruption, holding people accountable, and making sure this kind of abuse never happened again. Even after Margaret and the rest of her board were convicted, the ripple effect of their downfall kept spreading. The news of my fight had gone far beyond my neighborhood. Across the country, homeowners who had suffered under similar regimes started speaking up, sharing their own horror stories. Some had lost their homes due to absurd fines and illegal foreclosures. Others had been forced out by harassment, drowning in fees they couldn't afford. My case had sparked a movement, and I found myself in the middle of it. Journalists wanted interviews. Legal experts analyzed the case. Homeowner advocacy groups reached out to me, asking if I would be willing to speak at town halls, even testify in hearings aimed at regulating HOA power. It was overwhelming at first. I had spent so long fighting just to survive, to get my own life back, that I hadn't even considered what would happen after the dust settled. But the more I heard from people who had been through similar situations, the more I realized I had a responsibility. My fight wasn't just about me anymore. One of the first things I did was work with a group of lawyers who specialized in HOA abuse cases. They had seen too many people get steamrolled by power-hungry boards, and they wanted to use my case as a precedent. Together, we pushed for new laws that would put limits on HOA authority, forcing transparency in financial dealings, and giving homeowners more rights to challenge unfair rulings. It was a long, frustrating process, but it was worth it. Over the next year, multiple states started reviewing their HOA laws, some even implementing new protections for homeowners. At the same time, my own life was finally settling into something that resembled normalcy. My new home was complete, and it was everything I had envisioned, bigger, stronger, and designed exactly the way I wanted it, without anyone telling me what color the shutters should be or how tall the grass had to be cut. It was a statement, a defiant monument to everything I had fought for. The neighbors who had stood by me through the ordeal often came by to check on me, sharing stories of how much better life was now that the HOA was gone. The neighborhood was thriving, and so was I. But there was one final piece of justice that I hadn't expected. A few months after Margaret's sentencing, I received a letter in the mail, not from her this time, but from a lawyer representing multiple former board members who had been sued as part of the class action lawsuit. They were desperate. Their assets had been seized, their savings drained, and they were still drowning in legal fees. Some of them had even declared bankruptcy. They wanted to settle with the homeowners they had wronged, hoping to avoid even harsher penalties. For years, they had treated us like their personal cash cows, bleeding us dry with fines and fees. Now, the tables had turned, and they were the ones struggling to stay afloat. I didn't respond immediately. I took my time thinking about it, wondering if I even cared enough to push for more punishment. They had already lost everything, and no amount of money would bring back what they had taken from me. But then I thought about all the families they had ruined, the people they had forced out of their homes, the ones who didn't have the resources to fight back like I had. So, I went forward with it. I pushed the lawsuit all the way to the end. They had taken money from innocent people for years, and now they were going to pay it back, every last cent. The final ruling was brutal. The court ordered full restitution to every homeowner who had been unfairly fined or harassed. Those who couldn't pay had their remaining properties liquidated. It was a complete and total defeat. Some of them tried to move away and start fresh somewhere else, but their reputations followed them. Their names were now attached to one of the biggest HOA scandals in the country, and no one wanted to associate with. They had spent years building their little empire, thinking they were invincible. Now, they had nothing. Margaret, of course, still tried to play the victim. Even from prison, she found ways to make herself out to be some kind of martyr, claiming she had only been trying to maintain order and that the real villains were the ungrateful homeowners who had turned on her. She filed appeals, wrote letters to news stations, and even tried to get an early release. None of it worked. The evidence against her was airtight, and no judge was willing to give her any leniency. One day, I drove past the spot where the old HOA office used to be. It was abandoned now, boarded up and covered in graffiti. The building that had once been a symbol of control, where Margaret and her cronies had held their ridiculous meetings and issued their absurd fines, was now just another forgotten ruin. It was fitting. I thought about everything I had been through, every step of the battle that had led me to this moment. They had tried to break me, to strip me of everything I had, but in the end, they were the ones who had lost. I had rebuilt my home, reclaimed my life, and helped spark a movement that was changing things for people everywhere. As I stood there, looking at the empty lot where my old house had once been, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace. I had won, and I would never let anyone take anything from me again.